What do you think about what happened with the Bill Gates's involvement and basically convincing, I think it was the University of Oxford to rather than allow its so-called intellectual property to be more open source, but to sort of lock it up a little bit. What's your take on that? Your perspective on that?
I don't have the inside baseball on that one, but what I can tell you is this: when we were trying to get our low-cost recombinant protein vaccine out there, nobody was rushing to help us. I mean, we had to raise money locally here in Texas, which we were able to do through. That's one of the blessings of being in a place like the Texas Medical Center. There's, as opposed to being a professor at Penn or Columbia or Harvard, which is basically a hunting license to write grants, you can raise money in if you have to, if you've got a really exciting idea here in Texas. So we were able to get money from the King Ranch, the Clayburgh Foundation, the Dunn Foundation, MD Anderson Foundation. Tito's Vodka gave us $2 million, which was, not that I'm endorsing alcohol consumption, but should you have a vodka containing cocktail this evening, you definitely want to go with Tito's. So that was great. But the fact that I had to do that was, unfortunate, right? I mean, it should have been a much easier path to do something like developing a low-cost COVID vaccine for the world.
And you could not have gotten into something like warp speed. It was not in any way.
We could not get it. We tried. We could not get on their radar screen. We weren't basically the thinking was, unless you're a big pharma company, you don't have the chops to pull this off. And that was the end of the discussion. And there's still very much that mindset in the vaccine space that I'm trying to work. Again, and what I say, it's not to demonize the pharma companies. They do what they do. They provide a lot of vaccines for global health, for what's called the Gavi Alliance, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, but broaden the tent, broaden the ecosystem to give other players a chance because, and especially with partnering with vaccine producers in low and middle income countries. The other thing they did was they all went for brand new technologies, mRNA, particle vaccines. And when you do that, even though you advance the science and you get a lot of interesting new vaccine technologies, as any engineer will tell you, there's a learning curve before you can go from 0 to 15 billion doses that were needed when you use a brand new technology. So what happened was predicted and predictable. They made just enough to be bought up by North American countries, US and Canada and Western Europe, and that left all the low and middle income countries out in the cold. And that's when we were getting frantic phone calls from ministers of health and ministers of science in low and middle income countries because they knew we were working on coronavirus vaccines for 10 years or more. And they said, can you help us? So we did what we could. We transferred the technology with no patent. We would send our production cell bank by world courier to these countries and work with them on scale it up. And it worked. We got 100 million people immunized. So that was very, very exciting. But the whole system should have functioned better. There should have been somebody with that situational awareness to say, if we go with all brand new technologies, or what I sometimes call all brand new shiny new toys exclusively, it's going to leave the low and middle income countries out in the cold. Nobody had that situational awareness to say, well, maybe we should have a technology that could be compatible with vaccine producers that are in low and middle income countries. There's about 40 of them that band together and call themselves the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Network. And that's where we came in. And it was very meaningful to be able to do that, but also shocking, right?
That's my first reaction is like, well, how is that? That seems like one of those, like, there should be somebody in the government and I should be able to say to them, like, you had one job to do. And that's the job, is to figure out, like, how can we produce as many vaccinations as possible? And, I could even see, like, okay, we're going to go with like a low risk, in terms of like production and turnaround time and this and that. And we're going to go with like a moonshot version and we're going to do everything.
Right. Balance out the portfolio. Right.
How did that not happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's one day someone will write the book, but I think everybody was so enamored with the mRNA technology, and it is an exciting technology. It has its weaknesses. The durability is not as great as we'd like it to be, and that's why you have.
You mean it has to be stored in like a refrigerator, that type
No,
of thing?
no, you have, well, the fact that it's not holding up in terms of durability of protection. That's why you have to have all these boosters.
I see. Okay.
All the time for reasons that we're just starting to find out now because of long-lasting plasma cells and that sort of thing. But that's right. I mean, it would have been great if we could have had that better balance. And it's at some point someone will dissect out how all those decisions were made. But I mean, the U.S. It worked out because enough doses were just enough to be bought up by the U.S. and Canada and the U.K. and France and Western Europe and Japan. But there was no real true consideration for global health equity.
And the vaccine that you developed, is that a one and done, or is that do you have boosters for that, or you do it in a seasonal?
So it's a recombinant protein made through an older process, the same process as hepatitis B vaccine, a recombinant protein made through microbial fermentation in yeast. So it uses a big bioreactor. And this has been around 2 or 3 decades. It's used to make the hepatitis B vaccine. It's one of the lowest cost technologies out there, incredibly safe, simple refrigeration, great safety profile. So, when you start checking all the boxes on the checklist, it really is perfect for any country, but especially for low resource countries. Now we've just made the XBB booster version of it, a low cost XBB booster. So it costs around $3 a dose. And now we're doing this now for our other vaccines. We also have a whole portfolio of parasitic disease vaccines, like a new human hookworm vaccine. That's the project that I worked on as an MD PhD student in New York 40 years ago. Now, after 40 years, we're finally showed it's working. So that's very exciting.
And so why wasn't there a decision to sort of like somewhere within the U.S. Federal government health apparatus to say like, okay, we have this problem, rightly or wrongly, that people are very suspicious of the mRNA vaccinations. We have this vaccination that has been administered to hundreds of millions of people around the globe. I'm speaking of the one that you helped develop. It's low cost, and we can bring it back here, open it up, and I don't know. I mean, why wouldn't they even just like distribute it through Medicare or Medicaid? Yeah. Like, I don't understand. Like, what is there any political? Is there anybody in our politics today that is attempting to do something like this? Do we have?
Well, we've been approached by Elizabeth Warren's people, Senator Warren of Massachusetts, of course, woman Jayapal in Washington State, who wants to look into this and ask some of those questions. So I think people will start to look at it.
I mean, it seems sort of obvious to me.
Yeah.
In terms of like pushing back on this, like, lastly, like I know, like you suggest a sort of like a Southern Poverty Law Center for scientists in your book, which presumably would basically put some sunlight on the various anti-vaccination forces and maybe sort of like make more explicit the relationship between these sort of like entrepreneurial, the political entrepreneurs, as it were, in this space.
What's happening is, it's not only an attack on vaccine science or biomedical science, but it's also an attack on the scientists, and portraying us as public enemies or enemies of the state. And that's where it gets really scary very fast. So the climate scientists have been dealing with this for a while.
I was just going to say, like, is there a model from them that you?
Yeah, well, actually, now I've teamed up with Michael Mann, as a professor at Penn, the one who just won the lawsuit against. So Michael and I are now partnering on a new book, which is going to be called Science Under Siege. and it compares and contrasts the attacks on biomedicine with the attacks on climate science. And it's the two circles of the Venn diagram are not 100% overlapping, but there's a significant amount of overlap, and sometimes coming from the same sources. So we're hoping that will shed some light on, how we manage this. In the case of the climate scientists, they've actually created a climate science legal defense fund, something like a Southern Poverty Law Center for the protection. I mean, I feel well supported by my bosses at Baylor College of Medicine, the Texas Children's Hospital. But if you're a more junior scientist or, mid-career scientist, if you don't get that support, it could be a very lonely and scary place when you're attacked, and hoping to create something for them to have a resource to go to. It's unfortunate that we're not our usual people that you'd expect to be helping us or not. I mean, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy is silent. PCAST, President's Council of Science Advisors, is silent. The Health and Human Services agencies don't say anything to support us or defend us. And most of the scientific societies are fairly silent because they just don't want to get.
Nobody wants to get into the fight.
Nobody get into a fight and get attacked. And part of their reasoning is interesting. In some cases, they'll say, well, we have to be politically neutral, right? And because the only way to talk about this is talk about the partisan divide and the attack from the far right. They don't know how to manage that. But at some point, to paraphrase Desmond Tutu or Elie Wiesel, I have to say, if you're always neutral, it favors the aggressor, the tormentor, and that's what's happening as well. So we have to get comfortable talking about. It's kind of unprecedented. So I think everyone's playing catch up at this point.
Is the work, I've interviewed Michael Mann on this program probably, I don't know, half a dozen times over the years. I mean, because he was almost like the pioneer, at least one of the sort of the point people for getting attacked by science deniers in one shape or another. I imagine there were some folks, 50 years ago where, the cigarette manufacturers were doing this as well to specific doctors, maybe not. The doctors didn't have the same opportunity to communicate. Are you doing the audience for this? Is it there seems to me there's multiple audiences for, something that you and Mann would produce, right? I mean, one is the scientists, one is the policymakers, one is sort of like the culture and those people who report on it. Is there an internal apparatus to sort of say, we need to train scientists because it's no longer,
Well, there's multiple things. So you're asking all the right questions. I think one is, first of all, just describing the ecosystem is important because people aren't aware how extensive and pervasive it is, right? It's coming from, high net worth individuals. It's coming from political action committees. It's coming from the libertarian think tanks. These people are being recruited even from top universities to put out this stuff. It's coming from Elon Musk and Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it. And it's being embraced at the highest levels of the U.S. government through the House Freedom Caucus, 2 U.S. senators. So I think, and then the national media and even the mainstream media. I mean, Fox News is probably one of the worst offenders, but even you're seeing more and more this kind of false equivalency spill into the Washington Post or the New York Times, basically talking about that the scientists could have made the COVID virus in the same breath that, there was zoonotic spillover. And it's not the case. And so there's a lot of education from the mainstream media that needs to be done. So I think, how you walk this back is complicated. And I think one is the scientific community needs to feel more comfortable doing public engagement. My friends at Research America, which is a policy group based in DC, do these studies every couple of years, and they're quite consistent. They basically say 3/4 of Americans at least cannot name a living scientist, and if they do, it's Bill Nye the Science Guy or Neil deGrasse Tyson, and nothing wrong with them. They're great people, but they're not what a typical working scientist does in terms of lab meetings and grants and major revisions over paper. So we're invisible. So that's partly our fault. as a scientific community. And the universities tend not to like their docs and scientists speaking out because they're very risk averse. So how do we change that whole culture to make it feel more comfortable? I mean, I get told, for years, I would get told, or colleagues, now I have a little more freedom to do this, but for years is, hey, you're an academic, you're free to speak out whatever you want, ... but don't screw this up and get the institution in trouble. Well, of course, if you're out there enough and you're speaking out there enough, you will get the institution in trouble. And you need to know that you have that the institution has your back. And things are good at Baylor and Texas Children's, but others are not so forgiving. Then I think the other problem is we have the rapidly evaporating science journalists. We don't have science journalists anymore like we used to. So during the COVID pandemic, I had to spend a lot of time educating journalists without science backgrounds about COVID. And for the most part, they worked hard to get it right, but it was imperfect. So we need more science journalists. And then I think the big unknown is, though, how do we push back against the monster, this anti-science machine that's causing so much damage to the country, and that one, I think there I sort of give people the longest, I don't know the answer to the question answers I think I've ever given. I think everybody's struggling with it at this point. I mean, Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General, started this, and you talked about advisories with the social media companies, which is about the minimum thing the most innocuous thing you could say. But even then, now the Missouri Attorney General is suing him. There's a case going on in the Missouri Supreme Court, Missouri versus Murthy, basically saying we're not even allowed now to dismantle disinformation. So it's bad enough they're promoting disinformation, but now they're going to block any attempt to prevent you from going up against it. It's going to make it very difficult.
All right. Lastly, in terms of COVID, when you project forward, thinking about COVID, aside from I would perceive it like growing, or at least the continuing sort of anti-vaccination, sort of like a weaponization. Aside from that, when you look at the horizon here, in terms of COVID, what worries you the most? Is it like sort of the continuance of long COVID in some people? Is it the idea that we could have I don't know what you would call it, like a second order infection in the way that, shingles comes back from chickenpox 50 years later or something like that? Or is it a COVID mutating again in a way that becomes more virulent or problematic?
Well, I have both near-term and long-term worries. My near-term is, the good news right now, the numbers are starting to go down in terms of hospitalization. So I'm hoping the worst of this current JN.1 wave is over. But I think there's a high probability that another one will come up. Exactly which, I don't see any new variant becoming obvious, but I think, we have to assume there could be another one. And of course, people are done with boosters. I took my COVID annual immunization last fall. As I like to say, me and 6 other people did that. And
I was one of them.
But you get the idea. People are not accepted. So that's a big problem. And then the other problem is this. Remember, COVID-19, which is also called SARS-2, is the third major coronavirus pandemic we've had in this new century. So we had SARS, the original severe acute respiratory syndrome, in 2002. We've had MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, in 2012. That's why we began working on coronavirus vaccines, because we knew there'd be a third one. And sure enough, right on cue, COVID-19 appeared. But there's going to be a fourth one, most likely before the end of 2030. So we're seeing this cadence of every 6 to 7 years, a new major coronavirus pandemic, and no one's going to have an appetite to do much about it when it occurs. So that really concerns me as well, because this anti-science movement is so strong. So that's most likely what we're in for, and it's happening in part because of climate change. And this is why working with Michael is important, because of climate change. These are viruses that come from bats, and with warming temperatures and altered rainfall pattern, bats are flying to new places, seeking new food habitats. They're coming closer into contact with people. There's increasing urbanization and deforestation, so people are having more contacts with bats. This explains not only the rise of coronaviruses, but why we've had 2 major Ebola epidemics in 2014 and 2019. These are also Ebola or filoviruses that come from bats. So we are in this new normal. As I say, we're going to see a regular cadence of catastrophic pandemic threats, and that's why we have a White House Office of Pandemics now to look at that. But I worry. I mean, I think the good news is I think we can make vaccines pretty rapidly against a lot of these, but we still have the issues of equity, and we still have the reality now that there's so much pushback now against vaccines or any other kind of interventions. That's going to make it very tough.
Dr. Peter Hotez, Dean for the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine, and author of your most recent, The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science, A Scientist's Warning. Thanks so much for your time today. We'll put a link to that book at majority.fm and in our podcast and YouTube description. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Sam. This was great. I really appreciated the opportunity.